in your experience, do people of color, and you can say specifically even Black people, do we see its importance? So do we recognize that mental health is important? Do we value it as much as others?
I had the honor of doing a presentation a couple years ago at a conference, suicide prevention conference, and my topic, and I was able to present. My topic was African Americans and mental health, and we had a spirited conversation. And a lot of the people in the room, both from the African American population, offered a lot of insight into their thoughts on mental health. And of course, a lot of those people that were in the room with us were in fact mental health providers, chaplains, so on and so forth. And I think there's hesitation. There is hesitation with mental health, and I think again, it's about education. Me personally, my on my dad's side, you know, my dad didn't really talk too much about mental health. Like if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling whatever, they just kind of considered it the blues. And what you do within our culture, at least with me, is you go to church, you pray about it, you talk, to your family about it, to people close to you, your pastor, and so we have to break that stigma. And I think that kind of goes to what I was saying the last time, and that's through educational purposes. It's about just kind of showing that we can in fact do this, that we can in fact make this a big issue, we can solve this issue, we can solve this problem, but we got to be informative, and we got to encourage our own to take their mental health seriously.
I agree. Dr. Holly?
Sure. So value is subjective. The person who turns to alcohol, gambling, substances, they may value their mental health and saying, okay, I'm going to self-medicate, versus someone else who may turn to therapy and value their mental health in that way. And the reason why I brought it up is because we're looking at different generations. We're looking at boomers, we're looking at Generation X, Y, Z, millennials, right? And so going back to Brandon's point, when you look at our older generations, they didn't necessarily believe in therapy. Or if you consider yourself being depressed or anxious, you found a way to self-medicate and soothe. This wasn't something that you would go to some, old white man to sit on his couch and talk about. You may go to church and talk about it, but it wasn't looked at in that type of way. Then there comes the shame behind that, right? And I think now, fast forward, you are having this surgence where people are saying like, no, my physical health is just as important as my mental health. And this is what I can do to better that. I can go to therapy, or I can self-medicate. But at the end of the day, therapy is now a more readily available. It may not be socially as accepted as it can be, but I do think that we have definitely made some leeway there.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing as well. Danielle, anything to add?
Yeah, I want to pull from both of what Brandon and Dr. Holly said, and I think it definitely stems from a generational trauma of having to turn on that survival defense of I have to protect myself. I have to protect myself. I have to protect my people. I have to protect my physical safety, my emotional safety, right? The safety of my family. And generationally, we have been forced to recognize that danger is everything outside of us, right? Even opportunities to be better and to gain access and to seek support have been proven to be dangerous, right? And so I turn away from that because survival generationally has required me to shrink myself, right? To become quieter, smaller, to turn my light down, right? To make sure that I go unseen in a lot of ways, right? And that has navigated me away from opportunities for healthy support. And like Dr. Holly said, has definitely driven for me to find my own ways, right? To medicate or to soothe or to suffice for the problems that I'm facing. So I think I think the value is there because I would argue that we do value ourselves and our culture and our people so much and so sacredly that we protect it in the only way that we know how, in the only way that we have been taught how. I don't think it is a lack of value. I think that it is so important that we, in some ways, have shut ourselves away from the rest of the world because we are afraid of it being in danger, our mental health and our safety being in danger if we open it up to other people.
I think you all made great points there, so I'm going to let you all be the experts in that. Everyone has mentioned stigmas or myths, and so I do want to ask, what myths surrounding specifically communities of color would you most like to debunk? So we've talked a lot about education, and I think this is the best time in asking practitioners of color this. What would you like for everyone to know just is not real about mental health in communities of color? I will let Dr. Holly start. She just unmuted herself.
I would like to say that Black therapists do exist. We're magical, but we're not unicorns. We definitely exist. And so if you can't find one in your immediate zip code, then you just need to expand your search so that you can find one that's within your state. Now that we are continuing, to go through a pandemic, again, if you can't find someone in your town or city, you can find a Black therapist within your state. So if you're in Slippery Rock or you're in area of Pittsburgh and you are having a hard time finding a Black therapist, you could see a Black therapist in Philadelphia, where I am, because again, we're licensed within that state. So we are accessible, because a lot of times I'm seeing on social media how people are saying, oh my gosh, it's so hard to find a therapist. No, because if you could find a pair of red bottoms, if you could find, the latest or greatest, PlayStation that's coming out, or Siri, you can Google Black therapists. Like, again, we're not unicorns. We do exist. So I want to dispel that myth to say, like, we are here.
I 100% agree with that. Danielle or Brandon, do you have anything to add there? Or a different myth that you would like to debunk? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, mental health doesn't discriminate against anybody. Mental health can impact anybody. And statistically speaking, when it comes to the prevalence of mental health disorders within the African American community, sometimes we often experience as severe conditions like trauma. Oftentimes we think of PTSD and we think about military, which is it runs rampant within our military, veterans, men and women. But sometimes we don't think about PTSD in regards to race. How many places have declared racism a health crisis? And so I think we need to think about that and say, hey, this is a major issue. And what can stem from this health crisis and what has stemmed from racial discrimination is trauma. Sometimes people would just say, and then if you look at the disparities within, media, oftentimes, with our white counterparts, when there's a massacre or when there's anything that's going on, they tend to associate mental health with that. But when someone is African American and they do something, there's not an association with any possibility that this person might have mental health related issues. No, it impacts our community significantly and at an alarming rates. I mean, right now, I'm doing some research on why there's a high suicidality rate within our young African American male population. This is a significant issue, and we need to figure out why. Well, let's look at socioeconomic status. Let's look at environmental. Let's look at lack of education. You got to look at all of these various things that are impacting our community, and you got to say this is a significant issue, and this is a health crisis, and this should be declared a health crisis. And so, yeah, I think, for some reason, at least from my experiences, there's not, it's like, oh, Black mental health, you don't really hear too much about it, doesn't really affect them that much. No, it's not true. Actually, it affects us significantly and at alarming rates and severely. So that's just something that I feel is important for us to be mindful of.
Thank you. Danielle?
So I primarily work a lot with the babies. Middle school is my kids. I love that. And the myth for me that I am continuously daily working to get rid of in the spaces that I can is that kids of color can't because of X, Y, and Z, right? That if I'm having a difficulty learning, it's because I have ADHD or because my mom is bipolar or because of whatever the case may be, right? And not being able to recognize that our kids have just as much capacity as anybody else if they're given the information and the opportunity in the right way, right? Like, I don't understand how I can have ADHD, but also sit for 10 hours and get my hair braided, right? That don't read, right? So being able to understand your people and in opportunities to educate, to just be able to recognize that, like, what I think is something that they don't have access to is not always the reason why they are not succeeding in this moment. I have to figure out what it is that could be the barrier to them succeeding, because a lot of times for our kids of color, it goes beyond what's going on in a classroom, right? This is the same thing for like college students and universities and everything. It goes beyond what's happening in the classroom. My life does not begin and end during this school day. And for a lot of kids of color, revolving during the school day are the things that are going on outside of the classroom or outside of my, my job or whatever the case may be. So just stopping that limitation for people because we aren't understanding the bigger picture behind them.
Both you and Brandon had mentioned some specific barriers, as well as Dr. Holly. And so I do want to give you the opportunity. Brandon mentioned socioeconomic status, you've mentioned accessibility, education, are common themes that we've spoken about. I want to give you the opportunity to ask or to say, what do you feel individually and as practitioners that we should be doing to overcome barriers? I'm going to let you go first, Danielle, because you're on my screen, and then I'm going to toss it to Dr. Holly and then Brandon.
Yeah, to overcome barriers, I think just one, being more comfortable allowing ourselves to be seen, right? So platforms and opportunities like this, and recognizing that people need to see us, right? And like Dr. Holly said, we're not unicorns anymore. We are here, we are present, right? We have a voice, we have space, we have access for people to reach us if they need us. We have to be able to turn our lights back on and turn our voices back on and step into the room and let people see that. Also, I think seeing not just people on the ground level, but seeing people of color in leadership in these mental health agencies and these organizations and things that are put in place to support communities of color, but don't have people of color running or putting together these programs and opportunities, right? So we need to see people who understand and who have an opportunity to reach our communities because they understand our communities on a very personal level in opportunities of growth and just being able to have access in that way.
I think you touched on a really good point about, which is why we're even having this program with practitioners of color, is that this conversation really could be had with anyone. It's going to hit home more when it's coming from a practitioner of color. Dr. Holly?
Yeah, I think you don't have to be afraid. And I think that just goes back to my main point. Like, if you know that there's an imbalance there, or you're just having a hard time adjusting, maybe from moving across the country, or your parents being divorced, or losing a loved one, go to therapy. No one knows that you're going. No one has to know that you're going. But at this point in 2021, everybody's struggling with something, right? Some people can function better than others, but I think that you owe it to yourself in a world that can be so cruel and so harsh, that you can go to therapy so that you're able to be your best self and learn what that looks like with the help of another therapist that's Black or that looks like you, because they're also navigating that space. They can hold or be a vessel for that. they are clearly culturally competent and can understand and relate, to what you may be experiencing and what's going on. So I just encourage and challenge, our brothers and sisters to just definitely just go get a therapist. And you don't have to stick, with that therapist because, they're Black. You can find you a therapist that's Black that you resonate with more. It's a better clinical fit. So you can therapist shop. You don't have to, again, be in a therapeutic relationship that you don't feel that's a good fit. So again, I just encourage and challenge my brothers and sisters to go and find a therapist that clinically works best for them.
Thank you. Brandon, do you have anything to add?
Keisha, can you repeat the question? My thing froze a little bit, so I was kind of missing things here and there.
I'm honestly, we've been talking about a lot, so I may have lost the question myself. We were talking about overcoming barriers. So what you had mentioned a few barriers. And so is there anyone specifically that you would like to talk about overcoming and how we go about that?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, excuse me, a lot of the times, and from what I was gathering from Dr. Holly and Danielle was, kind of similar to what I was saying. The great thing about, this time and place is there are a lot more therapists of color out there for people to tap into. And that's just the reality. I think we have to understand that sometimes people just want to go to people who look like them. And there's not, and it's not a shade. It's not to say anything bad about, our white counterparts who are therapists, but sometimes, in my experiences, sometimes people feel comfortable talking to me other than a white therapist, because I might understand a little bit more than, and then again, it's not to shade them. I respect all clinicians, and that's just it. But I encourage them. I say, hey, I encourage you to seek out, different therapists, and if someone of color is your preference, then that's what you got to do. A person got to feel comfortable in therapy, and if they're not comfortable in therapy, it's going to have a hard time developing that therapeutic, relationship, that rapport. And so it is important for us to evaluate and for the individual to evaluate, what works for me, and to encourage them to seek that out. So that's just what I wanted to add to it.
Okay, I'm going to ask this one question, and then we're going to take a shift a little bit in our questions and start talking about things that may be a little more, I would say, Black specific. But the question I want to ask before we do that is, we all recognize that there is a shift that needs to happen within the community regarding mental health. And so I want to know specifically, how do you feel colleges and universities could support that shift around the narrative of mental health?
Oh, that's a juicy question. The first thing that colleges can do, especially PWIs, predominantly white institutions, is make sure that you hire a good ratio of Black therapists. You can't have, an all-white staff of therapists and say, okay, we're representing the university or the college. That's not true, especially if you have Black and brown students. You need to have, Black female representation and Black male representation, because you have Black and brown students who are coming there looking for an actual therapist of color. Like Brandon said, it's no shade to other clinicians, but if this is what I'm seeking, then as a student who I'm pretty sure is being taken out of your tuition, then I should be able to have access to that. Again, having representation is what really, really matters. And so I think a lot of colleges, universities, with their counseling centers, they just missed the mark clearly. And it's not a question of, oh, well, nobody, Black applies, or we can't find Black licensed therapists. I won't curse, but we know it. What I want to say, that's not true, because we do exist. And I think that if you can go out your way to recruit students, you can go out your way to recruit Black licensed female and male therapists to, again, represent that part of your student body.
Thank you for sharing. Brandon or Danielle, do you have anything to add or other opinions to offer there?
So I 100% agree and support that wholeheartedly, Dr. Holly. Listen, and I think I would add on top of that too, just again, I think the representation of people who are in charge of putting together programming and opportunities and these mentor groups and all this kind of stuff. I um, work a lot with transitional youth, right? Coming from high school and going into college. And I spend a lot of time in the spring doing different classes, just preparing kids of color for the fact that you are about to be a fish out of water, right? We know that we are a minority, but we are in the hood of Cleveland. So everybody look like us out here, right? We are familiar with that. And you are now about to hop into a situation where you are a minority and it is apparent to you every single day because you are going to be away from home at a university where most of the students and professors and staff look nothing like you, right? And I try really hard because I face that as well. And I spent a lot of time with kids who faced that and didn't succeed and didn't do well in school because they couldn't grasp the culture shock, right? The adjustment, the support was not there for that adjustment, that culture shock. It's a real thing. And universities, I think, and colleges need to recognize that for these students that we recruit. It's a great thing that I get to go from, that I get to leave the hood and I have a full scholarship to go to whatever school it may be, right? Ohio University or whatever the case may be. I get to go wherever, a Slippery Rock or whatever. But when I get there and I don't have the supports in place to help me specifically succeed, right? I was successful because I had people that I knew, places that I was comfortable supporting me, and now I don't have that. It makes a world of a difference, right? And there are kids who have so much desire and potential to be successful in these schools that can't be because the supports are just not there.
Okay. Sounds like another accessibility thing. Brandon.
Yeah, so obviously some very great points from both Dr. Holly and Danielle. And I believe Dr. Holly said, the universities need to be held accountable, and if you're looking around your institution and you see that there's an issue, look into it to fix it. I don't know if I said this in the beginning, but I run a nonprofit organization called Open Dies. And this is something that an initiative where we offer diversity education, cultural appropriation training, self-development training. And basically we go in and we evaluate the situation. It's almost like a consulting type of program as well, where we evaluate the need. And I have a great relationship with my local universities, Gannon, Edinburgh, Penn State Barron, so on and so forth. And I'll tell you this much, my thing is reaching out to those individuals and what are they doing? What are you doing to be inclusive? And we so often throw around the word diversity and inclusion and this, that, and the other thing. And sometimes I feel like it gets saturated. It gets kind of caught up in the mix. Like, no, we just hear diversity, inclusion. Like, what does that mean? It's important. Like, if we really dissect what diversity and what inclusion is, it's essential. It's essential to organizational structure. It's essential to institutional structure. And if you're not paying attention to your students, guess what? You're gonna lose your students. I've seen it happen. I've seen people who don't feel like they're part of the university campus. They don't feel a part of it because they're not, that the university is not being applicable to them. And so, I challenge them to look at their institution, look at the things that are in place. What are you doing to make your students feel at home? And so, part of my job is to go in and conduct trainings and workshops and saying, hey, are you being mindful of these various things that are occurring? And this is why you're losing students, because you're not being inclusive. And it gets lost in the sauce, as I like to say. And a lot of these universities talk about, they want to be more inclusive, they want to do more, they want to be more, but what are you actually doing to do that? And I have found that there is a lack of programming, there is a lack of evaluation. People have a big talk, but they don't necessarily put things in the place. So we do have to put the pressure on people. I mean, especially as people of color, we do have to kind of push the agenda a little bit further, and again, along with our white counterparts, because it's up to all of us, not just a few, to actually make change happen. So we have to reach out to our universities and we have to say, hey, what are you doing to be more inclusive. So I think that's an essential piece to the puzzle.
Thank you all for your answer on this particular question. I do want to point out to the students that are on the call that our President's Commission for Race and Ethnic Diversity is creating a packet of resources for students that are seeking counselors of color. And so it is not a resource that you currently have, but it is on the way. So I do want that to be made very clear before we continue. We're going to shift our topic just a little bit to speak specifically to a couple of things that I would say come up often in the Black community that I want to make sure we get to before we open it up to audience questions. I cannot find a way to tie these things together, so they are going to have to be asked separately. The first question is, can you discuss your thoughts around the philosophy of what happens in this house stays in this house? And for those that are unaware, it is something that is frequently said to children or people of color when there is something specific going on in the house that is not to get out to the greater community, sometimes not even to get out to other family members. So what is your philosophy around that? Brandon, you are on the screen, so you are up first.
Of course, I think, and to kind of circle back around to what I was saying initially about, the stigmas and that are placed within our community in regards to mental health. Oftentimes, in general, we are told to just, keep things in and deal with them. Don't talk about it. Don't expose yourself. I feel like, especially, as a person of color, as a Black man, as however you want to identify, you're told that, hey, there is a flawed system, and there is a flawed system, and don't talk too much about it because you'll become vulnerable. And I work with a lot of various different people, and especially in the position that I'm in now, I work with a wide range of individuals, male, female, Black, white, straight, gay, so on and so forth. And so it's detrimental to keep things in. But again, I also understand why people are told to do so. Keep it within here. Don't go out there and talk about it because there's so much, disparity. And there's a reason behind that, there's a reason that there is that thought process. Again, let's take it back even further. Look, I mean, slavery, in terms of, Black oppression and not having rights, people think that this was years and years and years and years and years ago. It actually wasn't. I mean, we're going back to the 1960s civil rights movement. My parents were involved with that. At one point, it was illegal for them to get married. And that was back in the 1960s. So this stuff is not so far removed. But there's a lot of people who've had that trauma who say, hey, we have a flawed system. Don't expose yourself. Don't let yourself be vulnerable, because that can open you up to a lot of different dangerous things. And so it's like, you want to sit there and you want to say, I get it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I understand where you're coming from. Like, I understand where my side of the family, my dad's side of the family is coming from. When they say, just keep things within the family, go to your pastor, go to your family. Don't talk about stuff to your health providers. It's like, I get it. But at the same time, again, that's problematic at the same time. So it's like a double-edged sword. And to try to change and shift perspectives and mindsets is difficult, especially within our community. And so, we have to figure out ways. And I think everybody's been saying that, the same thing. Hey, we have there. If you don't feel comfortable with going to someone who's different from you, let's look. There are people of color in various positions. Mental health. Medical. Seek them out if they are available. Get in touch with them. Of course, we know that's not always the situation, and what do you do in those type of situations? That's a scary thing, a scary place for people to be. So it's a double-edged sword. But of course, what I'm trying to do for myself and for my community, and what I'm trying to encourage is, I want to get more people involved in the mental health field of people of color. I want to encourage, my friends, who are thinking about mental health or thinking about healthcare, who are Black and brown, to push them a little bit further and say, hey, that's, don't think that you can't be that. Don't think that you can't do that. And so again, representation, often it does matter. And so again, it's a double-edged sword. It's hard to, I'll be curious to see what Dr. Holly and Donielle say about that, but it's a double-edged sword.
To ask them a different question. I don't mean to cut you off, and I'm sorry that I'm putting the pin around, but I'm going to ask them a different question. I'm going to say, you mentioned a specific word of trauma, and so I do want to get there. I want to talk about it. And so the question that I'm going to ask Dr. Holly and Danielle, and then of course, Brandon, you can chime in on the end, is can you talk to us about trauma specifically? And can you talk to us about things people of color experience but do not view as trauma, and how or why that can be damaging to a person's mental health? Specific examples of that is the strong Black woman mentality, microaggressions, which someone mentioned earlier, asking children to keep traumatic family secrets. Can you talk a little bit about those? So trauma, may not view it as trauma. How does that affect your mental health? Dr. Holly, are you ready to answer that one?
Yeah, so just with some context, because your last question does tie into
Right.
Your current question. So since slavery, we were taught to not say anything. So if you were raped or beaten or experienced any type of trauma, having your stomach, torn open and your baby torn out, you couldn't say nothing. And who would you tell it to, right? And so that generational trauma since slavery has spread into our communities, and it continues to spread because, again, the narrative is it happened in this particular quarter on this plantation. So it's not nothing you can say or do. So you leave it, you hear. You may drink moonshine, you may do whatever it is you have to do to self-medicate, but you get back out there into the fields. And that also birthed the strong woman narrative. We can't break down, we can't be vulnerable, we can't express any humanness, right? Like we talk about being magical, but we also need to talk about, like, in that magicalness, we are also still human, and we should be allotted the space to cry and break down and not be strong, because we don't always have to be that. But as far as the trauma piece, so much has been normalized because in society, we are now looked at as people who have pain or who hurt, like our white counterparts. If you think about the opioid epidemic, white people were prescribed opioids at higher rates, your Oxycontin and codones, right? But Black people, especially women who were giving birth, were not being prescribed those medications because we were supposed to believe to have a higher tolerance for pain. We're strong, right? We're human. So again, we have normalized, not because we know that it is incorrect, but because society just forces it on us. So if we have these narrative of the strong Black women, or whatever that narrative is, we as a society have kind of like just molded to that. And so again, if you see something traumatic, you've numbed yourself, or you just look like it is normal. So if you experience police brutality, right, that has been going on way before even Rodney King, you're like, it's normal. I've had a student who was beaten by the police. He didn't lose his life, but he didn't see anything wrong with it. He was just like, it just happened. It always happens. I'm from Brooklyn. It's normal. And I'm like, that's trauma. And he ended up having PTSD behind it. And so again, that's just one example on how we can normalize our trauma, and we don't see that we're human and we should be able to get help as such.
Thank you for sharing and also referencing your student and those experiences. I think those types of things happen often where it should 100% be viewed as trauma, and it's not. Danielle, do you have anything you'd like to contribute here?
Yeah, so my answer is kind of, you said you couldn't tie both those questions in, they tied in beautifully.
I tried, but thank you. Go on.
But my answer kind of stems more so from maybe a story, I guess. Like for me, when I think of trauma, I always think of safety. Like it is one of my favorite words, right? Because we water down the word safety a lot. It's so imperative and so important in pretty much everything that I do every single day. But like even just the relationship that we have on this Zoom call right now, and what we're representing and how we're opening other people into the space requires people to feel safe, right? To be able to share. And a lot of times every time our trauma causes us to not feel safe, right? And then when I don't feel safe, I've got to shut down. I have to figure out how to survive, how to move forward, right? That resiliency kicks in, that sort of thing, right? I work in one of the rec centers a lot of the rec centers in the city of Cleveland, right? We had a kid who left the rec, got shot 3 blocks up the street, died in the street, was laid in the street for hours, to the point where like we had to call for a bus. They wouldn't even send a bus for us to take the kids home. They just wanted the kids to walk home like they normally would, past our friend who was just on the basketball court that was dead, right? So it took a couple days, and like the energy was just the safety. You could just tell the safety of the people who worked there, of the staff, the people who catered to this kid and all of these kids who come in here. Things were just off. And I had to take an opportunity to like pull all the staff together. And we kind of sat down, and I just wanted to recognize, like, I need us to recognize what happened, because we haven't, right? It happened and we were here, and everybody was just kind of on like trauma. We were just on like go mode. We didn't stop moving. We had people to take care of kids, and nobody stopped. And now it's 2 days later, and we are continuing on with life as if nothing has just happened, right? And even in that moment, right, the staff were just like, Donyell, this happens all the time, right? Like this is, we have a wall full of kids, like floor to ceiling around walls of kids who have died, right? So it's normal. We're like, yeah, this, it happens. We just got to keep moving. We got to do what we can. We can't save them all. And we get that very like hard exterior, right? Where it's like, it's easier for me to be harsh about it than emotional, because I can manage that better, right? And so I had to kind of consistently reiterate the need for safety in our space, right? And recognizing, like, even if you don't want to talk about it right now, this is a thing that happened and it's hitting us, and I'm noticing it. And I need you to know that I'm here for you. Have a space with me, right? If you need that. And it wasn't that day, but by the end of that week, everybody at some point or another had found time to come to me, and we just like, we cried and we shared and we had space together. And it's just, our community, our people need opportunities to feel safe enough to feel, period, right? Opportunities to feel safe enough to feel. And once we get there, those barriers to us being able to access our emotions and our feelings and our generational trauma, that starts to break down. But we have to have that safety first.
Donyell, your story leads perfectly into my last set of questions. And so I'm going to ask Brandon first, because I cut him off on the end of the last one. But given Donyell's story, Dr. Holly's story, and honestly, the summer of racial unrest, how did you deal with that as a practitioner of color? So I'm going to open it up for Brandon, and then we'll go through.
Yeah, it was very daunting at first, because I had a lot of people at the time coming to me with questions. What do I do? How can I be more involved? How, and I'm trying to process what I had seen with George Floyd, as personally, because that was hard to watch. I couldn't even watch the whole thing because it was just, it was difficult. But, and I think kind of circling around to our first question about intersectionality and all of that, we feel hurt, we feel pain. What do we do with it? What are we doing with it? And we become resilient. And I took the time to process and to talk to my friends, to cry with them, to, console them. They console me. And then you figure out, okay, it's time to figure out what we need to do. There's only so much that we can do at this point in terms of grieving and being angry. Now we gotta switch it. We gotta turn this into being proactive. And so that's what, for me personally, I put all my energy into my organization, who, which, gave me a vessel to teach and educate and do trainings and do workshops, and to have conversation with my white counterparts who are reaching out to me, like, as a white, they're talking, they're asking me as a white person, what can I do to help the movement? And I was able to have these beautiful conversations with people and get people involved in the movement. And then for me, it was just about putting things into action. And without, talking too much about it, I think for me, it was just reflecting, picking myself up and knowing that there was work that needs to be done.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm going to give you a time at the end to plug your organization again for those that are interested. Dr. Holly, would you like to answer this question?
Can you repeat the question one more time? I'm
Yes.
sorry.
So as a practitioner of color, how did you reconcile with the summer of racial unrest?
Um, I don't think I reconcile with it. I just think that the pandemic heightened it. And because everybody was home and their television was on, you couldn't turn it off. You couldn't drive by it. You couldn't just, turn it off. No, it was literally forced in your face. And so it made the world look at the country like, come on, it's 2020. America is still doing years and years and years of the same type of racial and social injustice, you know. Um, so things that I have been doing is making sure that I continue to represent and work with Black women who experience microaggressions in the workplace. That's what I do in my solo practice. I specifically work with Black women because, again, they need to have a voice and know that microaggressions are real. This is not something that you're making up in your head. In addition to, like Brandon was talking about, I have been providing different trainings and webinars as well on microaggressions and how to have a more diverse and inclusive, work environment. And this isn't about, learning what to say and what not to say, but also including your hiring practices. I think in conclusion, institutions have to be held accountable. Individuals, our white counterparts, they have to be held accountable, whether you are an ally or you're in a position to hire, fund, promote, whatever the case may be. But we have to hold them accountable by as well as us showing up and doing our part in whatever that looks like.
Okay, thank you. Danielle?
Yeah, I think I'm a large part of me is still processing, right? I feel like yesterday was an entire, like last year was just like one really, really long Tuesday. Like it was just like, I'm still trying to catch up, right, with where we are. I think with just on a personal note, I think if what it has pushed me to is to recognize that I think, especially being a clinician in our field specifically, we are kind of taught this idea that you got to like earn your stripes before you step into like, our own practice and doing our own thing. You got to earn your stripes, right? You got to, kiss a couple frogs before you, get whatever. And so I think for me, I have just accepted the fact that I have an opportunity to create space for more people who look like me who need it, and I need to do that on a timeline that is urgent, right? Because things that are happening in the world are urgent and they need it, right? We don't have time to wait for when someone else might feel like it is appropriate for me. And because I am a Black woman, a lot of people don't think that it's appropriate for me. So I just need to like accept that, right? And take their opinion and their thoughts with a grain of salt and know that I have an opportunity to create space for people who need it, and I'm going to do that. And so that is something that definitely sped up my process from this summer. So,
okay, I'm gonna ask this question, but I also want for people to start putting questions in the chat for our panelists if you have them. We are winding down with our pre-questions. The question that I would like to ask is, often when discussing mental health in communities of color on a larger scale, we leave out the LGBT community. And so I want to know from your opinion, how can the conversation be more inclusive? How can mental health be more inclusive? What does the outreach need to look like in that particular area? Danielle, you're on my screen, so you get to go first.
Okay. So I think it needs to look like everyone doing their job in being informed, right? Everyone needs to, it's not there's no excuse anymore, right? If you step into this field and your job is to create a space, you need to know who you're creating space for, right? And you need to make sure that when they come into your space, you're ready for them to be there, right? Because it shouldn't be about me or anything like that. So making sure that you're ready for that. Also, taking opportunities when you can to educate people. The same way that we want people to take opportunities to educate about things going on with the Black community, there are different parts of the Black community that we need to make sure that when the opportunity presents itself, that we can spew out knowledge and information and resource and access, right? That we are making it very loud and clear that we are a space for people of LGBTQ community, right? The same way that I love driving down somebody's neighborhood and seeing a Black Lives Matter sign. I'm like, okay, this is a green zone. We love this. I would love to see the same thing with a pride flag or something that says that this is a safe zone for somebody coming into my office, right? It's all, again, it comes back to just consistently creating safety. If I have an opportunity to have the floor, my voice is the opportunity to create safety. So I need to make sure that I'm speaking to everyone and speaking for as many people as I can. So yeah.
Thank you. That was a really powerful answer. Dr.
I th-
Holly?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Danielle is saying. For me, is cultural competence. I think you have to be culturally competent so that you are not doing any further harm or trauma. I think that is, I can't express how important it is, because we already have a culture or a set of people who are already vulnerable, who are not trusting therapy, right? And so if they're going into a space already with that mindset or feeling, and then you're dealing with someone who's not culturally competent, then that could damage the person even farther, and really make their trauma even more magnified. So for me, I think it's just really, like Danielle said, being educated and having that cultural competence piece.
I agree. Brandon, anything to add there?
Yeah, and just it's about being mindful. It's about awareness, understanding that diversity itself is under the scope of diversity. There's so much more. Like there are a lot of factors here: mental health, LGBTQ. There are so many things that we can incorporate and we need to pay attention to. We don't want to leave anything out, and I think it's important for us to reach out to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and figure out what's going on. I just did this a month ago with a group, because I want Opened Eyes, my organization, to pay attention to that portion more. And me, I understand this. We hadn't been paying enough attention to it, and so I recognize that, and I want to be able to tap into that more. So bringing people within that community into the circle and saying, hey, what are some issues that you feel like you're experiencing, and how can we educate more? How can we educate ourselves? And that brings me to the last point here. Diversity is not just exploration about other people around us, but it's about exploration of self. And so knowing thyself is an important piece to knowing what's around you. And so in my practice, I always encourage that. Know who you are, because you have prejudices. We all have prejudices of some sort. Know your implicit biases. Be mindful and aware of those, because we all have them. They could be learned behaviors from when you're a child, something you saw on TV, something you saw on social media. Be aware of that. If you're not challenging yourself, you're doing yourself a disservice. And you're not going to understand certain concepts if you're not focusing on you. So I want to make it a point to everybody to focus on you, understand yourself, know your prejudices, be real with yourself, more importantly, so you can level up, you can be better, do better. And that goes for all of us, myself included. We have to, search internally and be better than we were yesterday.
As we prepare for audience questions, I want to make sure we ask this last question. There are a few practitioners on the call. So what I want to ask is, what advice would you give to other practitioners who do not identify as a person of color, but would like to be more helpful and insightful in their practices? Brandon, you get to go first.
My suggestion is just to educate yourself. At my place of employment, my coworkers, I do trainings for them, and we conduct them, and I let them know that it doesn't stop here. if you really want that change, again, you got to push yourself. And that ties back into what I just said a little bit ago. You gotta know, it's okay to not know things. It's not okay to continue to know things. So you have to be aware of that. Identify your ignorance, and then build upon it. Become more knowledgeable. Become, more culturally competent, as Dr. Holly had mentioned. That cultural competency is important, and that's part of the multicultural counseling perspective. And as clinicians, we are obligated to understand the people that we serve, and that's in any capacity. And if we're not looking to do that, and if we're not looking to understand cultures and different perspectives, then again, we're limiting our capabilities and our skill set.
I think you did perfect, but we would like to make sure everyone else has a chance to answer as well. So Dr. Holly or Danielle, are you interested in covering this question?
I would just add, making sure that you're comfortable knowing that it's okay to not all the way understand, right? And that people who are coming to you aren't necessarily always looking for that, because they know at the jump that you're not going to understand if you're white, right? Like you just know, right? So be comfortable with that, and know that the space is not about you, and it's not for you. And so maybe, making sure that you're checking those intentions at the door, so that somebody is entering into a space that feels like it is for them and only for them. And be comfortable. I encourage everybody, right? Like if you're going to see a therapist and you are of color or of any minority group, and you want to make sure that that person is best suited for you, ask Keisha to send you these questions she sent us, because these are great questions to ask the person that you're going to be sharing space and being vulnerable with, right? Ask these questions, have them answer them, get familiar and understand, their knowledge and their depth in how much they understand or are willing to understand you and where you come from in your culture, right? And just be comfortable knowing that like you're not all the way going to understand, and that's okay.
Dr. Holly, anything to add there?
Yeah, just going back to the cultural competence piece, and like Brandon said, educating yourself. And if you know that you are in a space where you are not open and willing to check your biases, I would rather that you refer that Black or brown, person out than to bring them in as a client and do them harm. It's literally okay to be a therapist and not have all the answers, and know that you're not going to work and serve every population. I only see adults. I don't see children, because I know that is not my population. So I want to bring them in as a client, because I will be doing them harm. So if you're not open to really educating yourself, checking your biases, becoming more culturally competent, then I would just really suggest and really encourage you to refer out, so that you're not doing more harm to an already, sensitive, or a population that's very vulnerable already.